Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next adventure that we have here, or the next session that we have on our summer webinar series. The title of this webinar is The Politics That Impact the State Budget. And we want to welcome you, and we are appreciative of all of you who tune in and join us on these webinars. You might notice that they are all recorded, and at the end, you are able to, if you miss part of it, there is also a resources page so that you can listen on your own time and also look at resources. Also, with the cancellation of the CASBO annual conference, these webinars until through the summer will be eligible for CE credits. So you'll be eligible to receive 1 hour of continuing education credit towards your recertification. So if you weren't aware of that, that's just a part of our hoping that will make this series even more meaningful for you. I know we're all in a little bit of an unusual situation and difficult territory to navigate, and we're hoping that the great speakers that we bring to you and the information that we bring will help you to navigate what's happening. So today I am pleased to have with us Sara Bachez, who's our head lobbyist at CASBO and does just a really exceptional job representing you at the Capitol. Also joining us, who will help with the questions, is Tasha Davenport, our Deputy Executive Director, and she'll be doing some of the logistics on the questions as we move forward. And our special guest is Kevin Gordon from Capital Advisors Group, who I know is known by all of you and very well respected in the community. So we have a terrific lineup for you. We have great information ahead. So I'm going to turn it over and let us move forward. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Molly. So, Sara, do you want to kick this off, or Tasha? There you go.
Sara.
There you go.
Good morning. To begin, I wanted to do a quick overview just to set the stage of today's conversation of where we're at on the state budget process. As we're all aware, on May 14th, Governor Newsom released a very draconic budget, which included drastic reductions of 10% to the local control funding formula, categorical reductions up to 50% for particular programs, career technical education, and the strong workforce programs, which are expensive and programs that have required extensive investment and support over the years. Deferral schedule of $1.9 billion from the June 20th to July 2020 schedule, and then $3.4 billion from unspecified months in the 2020-21 year to 21-22. There was still a recognition that special education needs increases in the base rate. So that remained in this governor's budget with the expectation that any federal resources would then be distributed more in line with school districts that have received concentration grant funding. And pension, there is a redirection of $2.3 billion to reduce the employer rate, contribution rates for 2 fiscal years. And so last week on Thursday, the Assembly closed out what they then highlighted as a reconciled legislative package, which rejected all of these reductions and adopted the deferral schedule proposed by Governor Newsom, but added $5.3 billion as part of their trigger reductions should federal funds not materialize by September 1st of this year. For special education, we've heard from certain LEAs that if they're already at the max of the rate, the governor's proposal would not receive any additional resources. And so I think we see this hybrid where $545 million in the legislative plan would go to increase the base rate to about $625 per ADA, with $100 million for students with low incidence. ADA, this is something that all advocacy groups have been working on, is an ADA hold harmless. And so the legislative plan does include language regarding instructional minutes and ADA hold harmless using the 2020 current year. in order to recognize the difficulties that it is to build out a new learning model given that we're still living in COVID-19 requirements. Modifications that were added as part of the legislative plan is including and folding in requirements from AB 1835 by Assemblymember Weber, which makes changes to the use of supplemental and concentration grant dollars, that any spent dollars must remain as supplemental and concentration grant dollars to be used for those students that generated and not to be folded in a future year as part of the grant. The plan does adopt the pension proposal and modifies, and a lot of advocacy groups, including ours, ask for modification on the federal funds distribution of $2.9 billion, that it go to all students that generate a supplemental grant. Any student that's low income, foster youth, or English learner should have access to those $2.9 billion. So we just wanted to lay out what the difference is that's still being deliberated. And we know that the legislative process is expected to have something go to the governor by June 15. And with that, I'll turn it to Tasha, who will moderate our conversation.
Thanks, Sara, and welcome, Kevin. And ask you what we might expect as a part of the June budget package.
I think I got the gist of it. The one thing, there are some things that are knowns that we know are in these packages. And by the way, I have to do a little shout out for Sara, who of course framed this up really great and is just, you know, she's just like the Energizer Bunny. She's constantly on all of these issues for CASBO. The organization is playing such a huge role in the entire deliberation of the budget and influencing the process over there. And I think you can actually see that impact. I mean, one of the things that I often say is that the state lawmakers will have questions about what the nuanced impacts are of these budget cuts. And there are lots of folks in the education community you can ask, but our members in CASBO actually know the answers. And Sara does a great job of conveying kind of the, you know, more on a granular level, what the impacts of this budget can be from a real fiscal standpoint to districts, and help convey like issues like the complicated issues of deferrals and what that really means for districts, and a number of the different kinds of things where people will come up with solutions, as I like to say, that are easier said than done. But there are some knowns about this budget that we do have to anticipate, because we know that both the Senate and the Assembly, and then thirdly, the governor, actually all agree. And some of those deal with, for example, the fact that all three, you know, parts of this equation agree on a deferral that will happen at the end of this month. The $1.9 billion deferral is almost a certainty, because it is not one of those issues where there's any disagreement. The same is true with regard to the deferral that would happen next year. That will definitely be part of any kind of a package. The other thing where there's agreement on, relative to pensions, that is something that's agreed to all the way around. And there are a number of these things where there seems to be agreement. One that's sort of a one little step back, but it's catching up quickly, is this issue of ADA hold harmless. And the big question has been, where will the governor be on this issue? Now, well, obviously the governor did his hold harmless in the executive order that we've actually had as a real blessing over the last couple of months. And that was important. But the Assembly and Senate are definitely together on the idea that that needs to continue. And I know there's a lot of debate in the field about the nuances of how that works operationally. People are concerned about what happens if you're a growing district. And I think to the degree that we move forward with that idea, which I'm very confident that we will, that some of those issues will get addressed. But the outlier here is the governor. And the one indication that I think could give a lot of districts some confidence that you're not going to have a problem with this hold harmless issue was when the state superintendent, Tony Thurmond, who is a guy that hardly ever sleeps because he's been so busy lately. I don't know how many calls he does a day, but he's been incredibly accessible to the education community, superintendents all across the state. And one of the things that Tony did in his announcing of the guidelines that we would use for reopening is he said that the entire document is predicated on the idea that we get the whole. Well, I can tell you that the California Department of Education has been working very closely on those guidelines with the governor. The governor's office and their team's fingerprints are all over this document. They've worked very hard on it. They would not let a document go out that's entire foundation is on the idea that there is going to be a hold harmless and not ultimately be for it. So I think we're getting an indication there. We had not gotten any sort of formal announcement by the administration where they're going to be on this issue. And I know the Department of Finance has been really looking closely at this, and really for good reason. One of the things they're concerned about, some of you may remember, and I think Sara was the source on this that helped get information out about, I think it was about 17 members of the legislature who within just a few short weeks of the governor's executive order that initiated, obviously, our shutdown, school districts shut down all across the state when the governor did the executive order that provided the hold harmless and a number of other directives. There was concern about whether or not, expressed by these 17 or so legislators, whether or not we just written a blank check and that nobody needs to care about whether we're actually serving kids. And they were concerned that there was no sort of accountability. And what we demonstrated, honestly, Sara was real crucial in this, is that she tracked down every single school district that corresponded to those districts and made sure they were communicating with those legislators and basically got all over him. In fact, we had one legislator that apologized and withdrew his name formally from the letter, and that was because of CASBO's good work. But the point is that they're looking at this issue, and as they go into the idea of a hold harmless going forward, they want to make sure they're not going to be vulnerable on that issue. And frankly, it's a good public policy issue to be concerned about. How are we going to be in touch with every student so that we're not leaving out, a fairly sizable percentage of our kids where we simply don't know where they are? So we're going to have to answer that question, but I do believe a hold harmless will be inherent in this. The title of this workshop is all about sort of the politics, and I do want to get into the politics of the lay of land, but I did want to sort of set the stage, Tasha, for the things that we kind of know are going to be happening.
Thanks, Kevin. Anything, Sara, that you'd like to add?
And as I'm looking at the Q&A, because we've mentioned ADA and instructional minutes, two questions have arisen of if we could provide more specifics and what does it mean. And so the specifics that we have right now was one sentence in a compromise document that the legislative budget shops have released that really says that it extends ADA hold harmless to the 2020-21 school year contingent on student engagement reporting and local continuity of learning plans. So all of this is still under development. We do not have language at this time because this again, this needs to be negotiated with the administration. This is a topic that, as Kevin listed, what three things have been closed and are in common with the legislature and the governor. Unfortunately, on this topic, that is not one that we have has the final agreement from the governor. So if there's something more you could add to that before turning to really what's taking place as we speak, the negotiations with the governor and the legislature.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Sara.
So on that issue, I mean, it is not known. We know conceptually what they're after, and that is some ability that would probably come with some obligation to do some documentation about outreach to every kid. And I think we have the technology now so that if you are doing distance learning, there are probably going to be logs, your IT folks. We're definitely going to lean on our friends both at CASBO and at SITE, which is the statewide organization of IT folks in our districts, to lend a hand on what that would look like so that we can demonstrate, perhaps if it becomes an auditable item, that we've actually done that outreach. And I think I don't know that it's going to need to be too prescriptive, we hope. But, you can count on Sara will be, at the first of the line to talk to them, the legislators, about trying to achieve the policy goal without actually ending up tying everybody's hands in red tape and bureaucracy.
I actually began my conversations last night in my sleep and woke up with my first statement.
Very good.
Well done. Hey, Kevin.
This is Molly. Can I just interject something here? This issue on the ADA is a huge issue because it is based on the fact that there has been a great deal of distrust historically with school districts about how ADA is accounted for. And it goes back to a time when there was one district that falsified ADA that was found out in an audit. So, you know, when we talk about the fact that what one of us does impacts all of us, as we're looking at this, I'm hoping that there will be more succinct guidance about the ADA issue, because if there's not, then we end up in these audits and this quagmire that just takes away our time and influence away from what we should be doing, which is serving the students we have. So for the legislature and for our members, ADA is a huge issue. And I think that that's going to be one that's going to take quite a bit of negotiations to come to agreement with. Thank you.
Great point.
Yeah. Kevin, can you share with us what's taking place at the federal level and how that interacts with our state's budget deliberations? And part two of that is what action can we expect and when can we expect action from Congress?
Man, I'd be a rich guy if I could predict that accurately. But what's going on back in Washington, D.C., as many people know, the HEROES Act that the Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats queued up was a $3 trillion plan. It was like a Christmas tree of all kinds of things in it. I think it was deliberately very, very high. And I think it was done so that you could make maybe potentially any compromise look a lot more modest. The president, going into passing the HEROES Act, the president had already articulated very little interest in the idea of trying to help out states and local governments with some kind of a backfill, but particularly states. He knows that if you just go based on formulas, that a whole lot of blue states would end up being beneficiaries of a major state bailout type of approach. So he's not been wild about that. Neither have been, of course, Senate Republicans. And so the conversation has been, what would they be interested in? And one of the things that's getting a little bit of traction is an education package, a stimulus package that answers some of the questions that Republicans want, which is to deal with liability issues for employers relative to COVID, contracting the COVID virus, a number of other kinds of things Republicans want that Democrats are not so excited about. If you did get to a compromise where they got a little bit, what would they be willing to do relative to stimulus that goes out to any kind of entities? And the ones, of course, we're interested in particular, is schools. So while we look for a package that would help state and local governments, that'd be great. A schools package would be great as well. And there's about 100 members of Congress signed on to a letter that proposed a package that was in excess of $300 billion for schools alone. That would help enormously. The Council of Great City Schools had their $175 billion package, a lot smaller. The HEROES Act itself only had actually I think it was $90 billion in it for K-12 schools. So there's all these numbers kind of bouncing around. The president has talked repeatedly about wanting schools to get going again and see things kind of get back to normal. He understands that that's going to be crucial for the economy to open up. That's why I'm hoping that he would be a little more sympathetic to at least an education package. And the reason why I'm emphasizing all of this is because in a lot of states, an education package, a big education package, and a much smaller state relief package doesn't help a lot of states. But in California, it helps us a lot. And the reason why is because California state government plays such an outsized role in its support of public education. So we would be big beneficiaries of a package that went out that was very heavily oriented toward education. That, Republicans get that. They also get that the politics nationally in this election is going to be significantly about where are Republican suburban women in this vote. That is going to be a core part of what has an impact on this national election in November. And in conversations that we've had with Republican leadership in the House, we know they get that issue. And education is a top priority to that demographic. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's hard to say when they'll get going, but we're obviously, optimistic that we could probably say something. There is a lot of talk, I will let you know, about the idea that there will be a fifth stimulus package. And we're hearing that on both sides of the aisle. The real question is timing. And the other question is, what will be the emphasis of that package in terms of what it will yield for California?
And for us, given that the legislative budget is really contingent on those federal funds materializing up to $14 billion, of which is why the legislature was able to rescind most of the reductions in Governor Newsom's package, I think it is important to really figure out when these conversations are taking place, how we as advocacy groups and as local entities can continue to send the signal to our congressional delegation that it is important that for California, this is really critical. And so news is coming about that, at least on the Senate Republican side, should they focus on passing another stimulus, it's focus on job reopening, and one of the components that was mentioned was schools, that in order to get workers back to work, schools needs to be part of the equation. So seeing that statement at least is a reassurance that both sides are listening, but the figures seem to be much smaller, as you mentioned, 1 trillion versus 3 trillion, and how much out of that 1 trillion in the Republican plan would go to schools. And so knowing that everyone attention to as the economy reopens, as every state starts reopening industries, we're seeing that jobs are returning, and hopefully as quickly as possible so we start mobilizing the economy. But for California, this really is whatever happens in DC, now we're tying it so much to our state plan, which we had not done in the past at this magnitude, right?
The other thing I was going to mention is that, just to give you guys a context of how big that $3 trillion plan is, of that entire plan, it was $500 billion. So a significantly smaller part of the whole plan. $500 billion was the amount that legislation had in it for states. So when people talk about this really needed new stimulus for states and local governments, knowing that only $500 billion was actually allocated out of that $3 trillion package for states means that if we're really serious about doing something to bail out states across the country, it doesn't need to be a $3 trillion package. It could be significantly smaller and still have tremendous help for us. In fact, I think almost every one of those plans, including the HEROES Act, even the smallest of those, which would be the Council of Great City Schools, would get to the number that the governor and the legislature, I think, would want to hit in terms of having an impact on our budgets. So, but again, the major dynamic that's going on today in the Capitol building is a choice between that drives everything with regard to the two alternatives. We have the legislature's version of the budget and the governor's, is what will they do relative to the trigger that's linked to the very issue we're talking about, which is federal assistance. And the one trigger, of course, that the governor has assumes that we don't get the money. We make cuts today, and only if we get federal support do we back off of those cuts. The legislature's approach is the opposite. It assumes that we actually do get support. We don't do the cuts now. And if the money does not show up from our friends back in the federal government, then there are targeted cuts that are made in different places. We know that the implications for us in the legislature's version of the budget would still be to forego the deep cuts to LCFF. The biggest consequence would be the largest deferral we've ever seen in K-12 education or K-14 education. Nearly $10 billion in deferrals in a single year, which is a scary prospect. But the cuts that we would endure in the governor's budget, in my view, are a lot scarier.
Kevin, we enjoyed spending most every early evening with you and the governor's office and the other management groups over the past few months, really informing our policymakers around what it was going to take to reopen schools safely here in the future. So the budget, now that we have it, do you believe that recognizes the challenges ahead and the work and changes ahead in order to safely reopen schools?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have said over and over again, and we're not trying to be critical of Gavin Newsom as governor, he has very limited choices, but it is totally fair game for us to be absolutely clear to the public about what the consequences of this absolutely awful budget would be for public schools. And I really commend that the legislature was as creative as they were in trying to come up with an alternative that, what I like to say, has priorities, it has values. Is that if you look at the governor's budget, all through the budget, Tasha, you're going to find the number 10%. And he pointed that out when he introduced his budget. He wants 10% cuts or rollbacks relative to state employees. He wants 10% cuts in certain agencies that he's outlined. He wants that 10% cut to LCFF. There's this 10% number everywhere. The problem is that an approach to a budget that is an across the board approach to the budget means you have no priorities. We can't let policymakers in Sacramento get away with a budget that does not make K-12 a priority. And the legislature's version of the budget says it's their top priority. That's what it says. And that's why the education community gravitates to it. It's not, we don't want there to be hard feelings in the governor's office, but what part of no cuts to LCFF and a COLA do people not understand by us being enthusiastically in support of that version of the budget that obviously has some downsides in it in terms of out-year risk, but for immediately, while we're trying to reopen schools, which is your question, we cannot do both. We cannot implement the deepest cuts to public education we've ever had in a single year and tackle all the cost implications of and the social implications of trying to reopen our schools and do right by our kids. You can't ask us to run public schools and, by God, you better give them a quality education and figure out how to do it with distance learning and everything, and then be cutting schools so deeply. The two just don't work together. And I think, honestly, the entire ed community, CASBO included, has done an incredible job of educating legislators and jumping on them. When Sara jumped on that group of legislators who had signed that letter initially and said, hey, we want you to know, we want to educate you about what's going on in these districts. What have we done on distance learning? What are we doing to make sure kids get fed? What are we doing across the continuum of services that we have for our kids and their families? What she did is she started basically an avalanche of communication with legislators all across the state that connected them to their local school districts to get input about what's going on. And I think that huge amount of communication that was going on between legislators and their districts is what made the difference when they go into a closed caucus room and they're all there together and they say, what are you hearing? Well, they got this incredible feedback, because whatever we do, we got to figure out how to insulate our kids and ultimately set the stage for us to be able to come back. And we can't do that with the kind of cuts that are in the governor's May revision.
Sara, do you have anything to add to Kevin's comments in response?
Yes, as you mentioned, Tasha, we have been part of endless communication because that is our responsibility to be the voice of our members, both at the state and federal level. And this has not been an easy task. As someone who, this is why I feel fortunate to work for CASBO. I was there as the budget consultant recommending the reductions to the Assembly on the Assembly Budget Committee during the Great Recession. And so all of this for everyone is PTSD that we've been here, but we have not been here in an environment of COVID-19, of a pandemic. And so we really are urging for a balanced approach, recognizing that may this be a short-term fiscal impact, but the reality is without resources, it puts us all in harm's way. And so we have continually advocated about the liability that is being placed on school districts and other local public agencies that are providing support. It is a topic and something that was asked on the queue that, yes, we have brought it up. The conflict that the state has in putting out legislative language regarding liability is they would have to then cover every public agency, not just schools. And that they recognize would be a huge cost on the state. But I think for us as public agencies, for schools, we have to speak up that there is a huge liability as we're reopening and getting conflicting informations and getting additional guidance that comes out, what feels like every 24 hours, that you are all making the best decisions with the resources and the staff and the ability of your community to move forward. And that has to be respected, that at the end of the day, we are here to serve our students and our communities. And so that is something that we are very cognizant about is the risk factor, given that it is a pandemic. It's not just a fiscal calamity that's taking place. And so I just wanted to highlight that that's being factored in our communications, that we are constantly urging legislators and this administration to recognize what's at stake, that we're not just any public service, we're educating children.
Thank you. And so another crystal ball question for you, Kevin, as we expect the revenues to come in for the state July 15th, when that happens, what can we expect to see in terms of future budget agreements evolving after those revenues are received?
Right. Well, one of the things that I'm sure has occurred to a lot of our audience that are involved with school finance is that if everything had gone normally and we did not move the tax filing deadline from April 15th to July 15th, then everybody would have filed their taxes on time. And think about what year they're filing their taxes for. What year was it? Last year. It would have been what they earned for the year that there was not COVID. So the question really is, of all the sort of forecasts that are being given, and we slice open those envelopes every year around April 15th, and we take a look at what's happening to revenue, how different would those numbers have been? Probably not a lot different in terms of a real big downward trend for the prior year. What the scary part is the forecast, which obviously budget writers and the legislative analysts are all trying to get their hands around, is what does it look like for next year? And one of the indications of what that's going to look like is when we do get the tax receipts in July, obviously we'll have what all that tax behavior was for last year and based on income in the last year. But what we're going to get is quarterlies for people who make a lot of money that pay their taxes quarterly. We're going to have 2 quarters worth of data. That's going to give us a lot of information about what the future looks like. And what obviously we'll be hoping for is that those numbers would be better than perhaps what the governor had in his May revision. And because remember, the governor's May revision was no more accurate, was as much a guess as the January budget. He had 0 data. All he could go off of was economic forecast. So it's a great question, is that what does July 15th look like when we start opening those envelopes and seeing what kind of tax revenue we have? I'm going to be really curious. What we're hoping is that the Department of Finance and the governor, taking a page from their former governor, Jerry Brown, learn something about make sure you under promise and over deliver. That is, overstate the size of the problem. Because to understate the size of the problem would be just disastrous for us if we had to look at not just this reality that we face right now, but something worse would not be good. I'm fairly confident that they've done that they've overstated the size of the problem. And that was a little bit validated by the nonpartisan legislative analysts who looked at these and had slightly different numbers, a little bit better forecast, slightly better forecast, particularly in the current year than we saw in the Department of Finance's estimates. They're very, very similar for the most part. But what we're hoping is that both of them are being conservative in their approach and that July ends up bringing some better news. There was one question that was asked, and I know you guys, the vast majority of people that are on this call know the answer to this, but at the end of the day, what do we budget on? I wish I could tell you to sort of like put on a blindfold and cross your fingers and go for it regarding the legislature's version of the budget. But you know, there's always this sort of unwritten rule that we predicate the budgets you write and you take to your boards on the May revision. With all of its flaws, that's the document that you use. And yes, it drags people through a lot of pain and difficulty, especially if things end up being better. But you know what? It's not bad for policymakers in Sacramento to see what the reality is of what you would have to do if in fact you have to invoke these kinds of cuts. It's not fun politically at the local level, but it is a necessary sort of evil of the process. And we use that information about what's going on with regard to proposed cuts when we work in the legislative arena and try to illustrate to them what's going on.
And I think that in July, we'll also, once we see hopefully an uptick of the revenues, this is why it's important for us to be part of the conversation of why education matters. Because if there is an infusion of resources, we need to make sure that we are also prioritized in that arena. But I believe that a lot of these policy decisions are going to be deferred and not part of the June budget. And so many of the conversations that of the questions that you have in terms of instructional minutes and what would that look like, if that is not finalized in 3 days, I see that being part of the July conversation to see what changes would then need to take effect. We have to make it real for these folks. ADA in Sacramento just sounds like an overall, what's the state overall information of students we're serving? They don't realize how integral that is to your budgeting process as you're looking out and doing multiple years of planning. They don't recognize if you are in declining enrollment, which is affecting 60% of our LEAs, what the implications are. And so, yes, there's this push and pull of let's protect as many jobs as possible and not make the unemployment numbers go up in the education world, which then leads to more delays in the recovery of this economy. But we have to paint that reality that if there is no flexibility in terms of how we manage our services, then none of this will become a reality. And unfortunately, I think that because of the June 15 deadline not having all of that, the revenue information, I could see us still being engaged in all of these conversations that should become more of a reality in July and August. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that obviously we've all been talking, Sara and I have been both talking about the prospect of an August revise or August revision. Well, that's almost a definite that we're going to have some sort of revised document on the budget, because we joke around, and you guys have heard this over the years. What we do know about all these numbers, they're wrong because they can't be precise, right? There's just too many unknowns. So what we do know is that they're wrong. The question is by how much. And so when we get all that information in July, then we'll be making adjustments, and we'll see what happens there. One of the things I really want to turn to, Tasha, is the political dynamics for which this whole session was sort of named, and get into some of the politics when you're ready to jump into that.
We're ready to jump in. Go,
Okay.
Kevin.
Okay, cool. So the one major thing that you guys have all noticed is it is an even numbered year. It is an election year, and don't think that is not affecting the dynamics over at the Capitol building. The tougher decisions, the difficult decisions that some of our folks have to make, they would much prefer to make in an odd number year than an even numbered year. It's not a coincidence, I think, honestly, that that the governor, who is not up for re-election, has a budget that's a very hard-hitting, tough budget with a lot of very, very tough political decisions that he's made. But again, he's not up for election. His name will not be on the ballot in November. For all the rest of the legislature, so half of the state assembly, half of the state senate, and all of the state assembly, their names are going to be on the ballot in November. They care a lot, and they're doing a lot of creative thinking about how can we address these issues in a way that is meaningful to voters, but also has some fiscal responsibility. And so those pressures are what's affecting the versions of the budget that you see. One of the things that's going on right now, what we were hoping is that the governor would take a look at this very creative plan that the legislature has done and have the ability to back off a little bit and say, this has been done once before by a guy named Jerry Brown. And if it worked for Jerry Brown, the Yoda of state finance, right? Who had to wrestle basically the biggest fiscal crisis we'd ever had up to that point And he conquered it. And he did it in large part with deferrals. And there were years where the governor, some of you might remember this, where the governor himself said, adopt a budget that assumes no cuts, because he had a ballot measure that would pass new taxes that would come to the rescue. I thought it was crazy. And we actually urged districts to prepare budgets that did the cuts anyways, because we wanted voters to see the consequences of those cuts. Not a terribly different circumstance than what we're facing right now. Districts did adopt budgets with cuts in them, and the voters came through narrowly, but they came through with a package of funding that ultimately made deeper cuts not necessary for school districts in that particular year. So, I mean, we would have had these trigger cuts of a great deal more money per kid if those taxes ultimately didn't end up materializing. But so what we're hoping is that the governor could be persuaded by somebody that he admires a lot, you know, in terms of Jerry Brown's approach to the budget, and see that the legislature is trying to emulate that a little bit. But what we're hearing is of late is that the negotiations aren't going so well, and that I think the legislature is poised to go in and pass this budget that the two houses have agreed upon and get that done by their deadline, which is Monday. And then we'll see how the governor reacts. Now, the governor has what we call blue pencil authority. He can line item veto lots of different parts of this budget. But the education part of the budget is very tricky for the governor, and that is because he cannot invent new law when he gets a budget. He can't write new law. He can't do anything other than either veto the entire budget or do line item vetoes. And much of the education part of the budget is what we call statutory. There are provisions of it that are ongoing appropriations, and they're not appropriations that the governor can veto necessarily because they are statutory. They are not subject to the Annual Budget Act. So it's a trickier budget, but I wouldn't put it past the governor to veto the entire budget and ask the legislature to try again. And then you would have more negotiations happening in earnest. I'm optimistic that we're going to get a budget that's better than the May revision. And maybe that doesn't help you guys much in your budget writing, but it would be impossible for me to say or handicap the chances that we get the legislature's version of the budget unless there's some negotiation before Monday where they come out of this. That's our best hope, to have a budget that looks a lot more like the legislature's budget, is if there's an announcement before Monday. But if we don't get an announcement before Monday, I'm afraid that we may end up with a budget that's better than the May revision, but we have to brace ourselves for cuts to LCFF.
It's insightful, Karen. Sara, would you like to comment?
Yes.
Karen.
It's one of those days. The question that I wanted to pose to Kevin, because you're right in terms of where we were with Jerry Brown, seeing him then push for Prop 13, which helped weather the reductions that still were made, but started the path of restoration. In this question that came through the queue was, there is a November ballot, community and schools first.
Right. And
so I think for folks, there's a lot of support in it, but the governor hasn't come out yet to make a statement. We saw what happened on March 3rd to our Proposition 13 on school bonds. And so one thing we remind folks is that because it's based on property tax, we won't see any resources until 3 to 5 years from now. It's not a quick solution like Prop 13, Prop 30, and Prop 55. But in your, crystal ball, what do you think of what's going to take place in November?
No, it's a great question about what's going on with the November ballot, and even one that may happen in 2022. But the oncoming ballot will likely have the split roll ballot measure on it. There is still, amazingly, some time for something to actually be negotiated on that particular ballot measure. It has not, while it has been sort of certified, there is a period in which there can be some negotiation and changes made to that ballot measure. But there's a lot of other politics that are connected to that I'm not so sure we're going to see some changes. Organized labor is pushing really hard on the split roll ballot measure that would give half of its revenue, actually a little bit less than half of its revenue, to public education in this state, generating probably in a best case scenario $3 to $4 billion annually. Well, now we're starting to see what, you know, I've been critical of this ballot measure because I've thought that it was very, very less than ambitious in its number, $3 or $4 billion. Now you're seeing the context of what I mean. When we face a budget shortfall of $54 billion, and they're actually talking about a shortfall in Prop 98 of $19 billion, what does $3 or $4 billion do for us? I just think it's not being sort of honest with voters about what it takes to really bootstrap education investment in California. And then the other thing that I'm sure that the framers of that initiative didn't count on was the kind of crisis that we face where the sentiment of voters, even liberal voters that tend to be in favor of taxes, they know businesses are hurting. And even if they have a crystal clear understanding of what this ballot measure does relative to raising property taxes only on corporations and businesses, they're going to be not very sympathetic about hitting businesses and corporations these days, given the hit that they've taken in the economy. It's just a weaker position to be in. But more likely than not, there won't be an understanding, a crystal clear understanding, and the people that will be opposing the ballot measure will actually cue this measure up as an attack on property taxes overall, scaring voters into think that not only is it on business and corporate held property, but it's actually going to be you next. And by painting that picture, and we saw, Sara, you used the appropriate example of what we saw with the school facility bond Prop 13. People thought that ballot measure raised their property taxes, which was not correct. And they did so based on a lot of the same folks that would be opposed to the split roll ballot measure. So if we lost on that ballot measure, what happens when this one is the ballot measure they think it is? I think it's going to be really, really a tough sell. Now, the flip side of this is that if we do invoke very deep cuts to public education and people see the huge damage it's doing to public schools across the state, that could end up shifting things a little bit. I just don't think it's going to be enough to get it passed. What does happen in this dynamic, and the timing might be absolutely perfect, is queuing up a real serious debate about the better ballot measure, which is the one that CSB and AXA have been working on, and I know that CASBO has been involved with advising on as well. And that is the ballot measure that's the upper end tax increase ballot measure that would appear, at least they're aiming for, the ballot in 2022. The timing would be good in the aftermath of obviously really strained resources for public education, and you get that property tax issue out of the way this year. You don't have that to compete with. I think it could do really, really well. And the polling has been consistently extremely good on that ballot measure. So anyway, so that's my take on that.
Kevin, Sara, thank you. I want to turn it over our last bit of time here to the questions that we have. So Christina, I think you have some in queue, and let's go ahead and start tackling those inquiries.
Yes, definitely. So recently I had a question asked about the legislature. How much power does the legislature have in this budget, considering it has a 2/3 majority in both houses?
Yeah, super good question. Is that the Democrats in both houses have bigger majorities than at any time in my career. And you could even let several of them off the hook from voting against, quote unquote, their governor and still get a veto override, at least in the assembly side. The numbers are there for the Democrats to go into the governor's office and say, look, we need to have a budget that looks like X, and portray that to the governor, because they do have the votes to do an override. An override is a very serious thing. I don't know at the end of the day that there'd be the sentiment in the legislature to do that, but I know there's a lot of anger in the legislature with the governor because of the position on a number of different issues, the position they feel like they're in, that they've given him a lot of running room over the last few months to have basically the entire spotlight and the mantle of leadership statewide without a legislature. They've given him a huge amount of power in that process. I think he's done actually a really remarkably great job. But that said, I know there's grumpiness in the legislature of just exactly what kind of power the governor has wielded, and that they want him to reciprocate with the kind of trust and partnership to give them closer to their version of the budget than his. And if they did come up with a compromise by some chance before Monday, I think it would be the making of a long-term, very solid relationship between the legislature and the governor if they could hammer this out. If this ends up becoming a showdown where the legislature actually has to pass their budget before they have an agreement with the governor, I think things can get ugly and really hamper Governor Newsom's tenure for the rest of his term this time around and maybe into the future. How he behaves now with the legislature is going to be really, really important.
And a recent poll just said that Governor Newsom still has really strong favorability in the 70%. And so I think that's a dynamic that this legislature has to think about as they've been home. And I think this is an election year and haven't been able to pass the number of legislative proposals that we would have seen. They all had to scale back that expectation. So I think seeing that release from PPIC that last week was a aha moment to me of they have to be cautious and careful if they do an override to a veto or how they proceed, given that this governor still has really strong favorability from constituents.
When Jerry Brown vetoed the legislature's budget some years ago, I think it might have even been the very first budget that he did over
2011.
What he thought was irresponsible and such. His polling numbers actually went up. And so it's funny you mentioned that because the PPIC poll that you refer to, there was a lot of talk in amongst the members in the legislature the day before that polling data was released. And the next day, when we were talking a little bit about some of the sentiment of legislators, we sort of looked at those numbers and said, oh my gosh, that's a new dynamic. And I thought could potentially embolden the governor to be tougher on this budget negotiation than he otherwise would be when you look at polling numbers that are just that good. The 70% figure was the response by voters and also all the people that were surveyed. The highly likely voters was about 68%, 69%, and the total population of folks in the poll was 70%, just slightly higher. And basically, they were responding to the question about how well have you handled the COVID crisis. His overall popularity numbers are still very, very high into the mid 60s on just overall job performance. But you're so right. Those political numbers have a really big effect. One thing I want to touch on real quickly before we go, because I know many of you care about this, and there was a reference to it that Sara made in her slides, and that was the distribution of federal funds. One of the big controversies right now about this budget that we will get an answer to in the next number of days will be whether or not the governor's May revision proposal over a big old hunk of money, $2.9 billion, will go out basically only to concentration grant districts, or whether or not it'll go out the way the legislature wants to funnel it out under LCFF. The governor made comments publicly about the fact that he thought it was wrong for this money to just be distributed out on an equal basis to every kid, and that it ought to go out with a tilt toward poverty. I was startled by that comment because it suggested a lack of understanding about the way LCFF works, which clearly is tilted toward kids in poverty. But the governor said he's not likely to compromise on this issue at all. So we'll see where this ends up, but it's a major issue that has huge fiscal consequences for districts all across the state.
And then one final question that I'm grouping 3 is on the August layoff window under the legislative plan, because it assumes no reductions and it assumes a COLA, it closes that opportunity. So what do you foresee as districts are still challenging and dealing with difficult budgets?
Right. So the only way that the layoff opportunity goes away without the legislature affirmatively setting it aside would be if we get basically the current year budget plus a COLA that's north of 2%. That's how that happens. If the governor is not happy with this part of the budget, the education part of the budget, and is successful in getting some kind of a cut. Well, a cut means that we're not getting COLA. A cut of any kind that took us below the current year would invoke this challenge. Now, the legislature can and has in the past then put in what we call notwithstanding language, which would say, notwithstanding the provision of law that allows local school districts to do layoffs during July and August, when there is a increase below, basically we don't have an increase above 2%, that they would put that language in that would take away that opportunity to us regardless of whatever the cuts might be. They could do that. I just think the reason why they took the approach they did is because they know that we're being hit with all kinds of costs, and that how can you with a straight face cut public schools when the law has an intent there, that when we're not funded at a certain level, we're a people intensive business. We have no choice but to do layoffs when we're cut. We are, again, it's all about a whole lot of teachers and classified staff, administrators and others. It's people, and you can't balance a budget in an entity like ours that's so people intensive without doing layoffs. So we're hoping that kind of pressure creates an imperative for the governor to see the wisdom of a budget that gets us at least to the 2% plus level over the current year.
Kevin, Sara, thank you for your insight, experience, wisdom, and all the helpful information. What we're going to be doing is answering the rest of the questions offline. Sara and Kevin will work together to get those questions answered. We'll turn that back out to you with the recording and the slides here in short order. But again, thank you for your time today, your support of our members and these important topics at hand. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.